Revelation chapter 17, this begins the sixth segment of the book. In our previous session, we took the fifth segment, which was a very short one. In fact, we took more than that. We took chapters 15 and 16, which I take to be the fifth segment. We also took chapter 14. The sixth segment is chapters 17, 18, and 19. And I hope that we can take the entire segment. It seems possible. Now, chapter 17 contains what probably should be identified as the opening vision of that segment. John is carried away into the wilderness where he sees another vision and is given an explanation of the vision. And then we have what in the notes that I gave you in the outline we could call 7 declarations of victory over Babylon, God's victory over Babylon. Now, it's in this section more than any other that we not only need to, but have opportunity to understand who Babylon is. We've encountered Babylon in chapter 14, verse 8, for the first time, and we've encountered Babylon in chapter 16, verse 19, but in those places I've been able to tell you what I think Babylon refers to, and mention there are some other opinions. It'll be in chapters 17 and 18 where we get the most information on this. In fact, I would like to read chapters 17 and 18, without comment first, so that afterwards I may draw from it the various data. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is." In some manuscripts that last yet is actually shall be present. So it would be the beast that was and is not and shall be present. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. And the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Yeah. And he said to me, "The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, and make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a habitation of demons, a prison of every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double, according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed, mix it for her double. In the measure that she has gloried herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. And the kings of the earth, who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her, will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys her merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. Probably referring to slaves. And the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things, who became rich by her, will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city, that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches come to nothing. And every shipmaster, all who traveled by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What is like this great city? And they threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon will be thrown down, and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you any more. And no craftsman of any craft shall be found in you any more. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you any more. And the light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more. And the voice of a bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all that were slain on the earth, or possibly in the land. Now, this is not the end of the segment, because chapter 19 goes on, but in chapter 19 we don't have any further information that would help us to identify the harlot, and that's who we need to identify right off. Now, chapter 17, he sees the vision. In chapter 18, he simply hears announcements made by various angels. These announcements have to do with the fall of Babylon, and the language of them is sort of like the funeral dirges uttered against Babylon in Jeremiah 50 and 51, and also taken from some other dirges. There's some language here taken from Ezekiel of the fall of Tyre and Sidon, especially Tyre. And in one case, in verse 5 of chapter 18, there seems to be an echo of the fall of Sodom, or the sin of Sodom. So, what we have in chapter 18 is a mosaic of phrases from funeral dirges or laments that were uttered over cities in the Old Testament that fell. Most of the material comes from Jeremiah 51 and Ezekiel 28, which are dirges against Babylon and Tyre. Now, to identify this city, we go to chapter 17, because there we are told that we're getting an explanation. In verse 7, the angel said to me, Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her. So you expect to get some insight. However, as usual, the explanation is in some respects as hard to understand as the mystery itself. and the explanation doesn't necessarily clarify things as much as we would like. We should point out that, first of all, John saw in the wilderness, he was carried in the Spirit to the wilderness. The last time we saw the wilderness in Revelation was in chapter 12, where the woman who fled from the dragon was nurtured by God for 3.5 years into the wilderness. Here we see another woman in the wilderness. Not the woman of chapter 12 who fled for safety to the wilderness, but we see this woman now in the wilderness, and she is a harlot, whereas it could be argued that the woman who fled to the wilderness in chapter 12 was the bride. And we have a contrast between the bride and the harlot in the book of Revelation, just as we have a contrast between Babylon and the New Jerusalem. The two entities that are contrasted in Revelation are variously compared with cities or women. And it is clear that the harlot is Babylon, and that the bride is New Jerusalem. Now here, he sees the woman, but she is riding upon a beast. The beast is somewhat familiar to us. The beast is said to have 7 heads and 10 horns in verse 3, and that is the description that we saw of the first beast that came out of the sea in chapter 13, and therefore is almost certainly the same beast. Here we're told in verse 3 that it was scarlet in color, red. We were not told that about the beast in chapter 13, but in chapter 12 we saw that the dragon was red in color, and he also had 7 heads and 10 horns. So it would seem like the beast we are now told was red, had 7 heads and 10 horns, and all those characteristics it shared with the dragon. The dragon was Satan, and therefore the beast seems to be Satan in disguise. Satan with a thin skin or veneer stretched over him, acting through some kind of entity which could, as I said earlier, represent the state systems that Satan inspires against Christianity to persecute the saints. That's what I suggested in chapter 13. Now, at the time in which John wrote this, the particular state system that was doing this was the Roman Empire under Nero. And for the sake of his own readers in the first century, he tends to identify the beast for them, I think, as Rome, as Nero and Rome. And he does that when we get to chapter 17, verse 10. We saw this previously, where he talks about there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, that is the 6th, and 1 is not yet come, and when he comes he must continue a short time. If the 7 kings refers to 7 emperors, the first being Julius Caesar, the 6th, the one that he says now is, would have to be Nero. And therefore he identifies as what was at that time the current manifestation of the beast's activities was centered in Nero and the Roman Empire. And the beast has all the marks of Rome. The 7 heads not only represent 7 kings, but we're told they represent 7 hills, 7 mountains. In verse 9 it says, "Here is the mind that has wisdom. 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Rome was proverbially called the city of the 7 hills, and therefore any ancient reader would be inclined to see this as a reference to Rome because of the famous 7 mountains there. And so, by the way, the angel is saying that he's explaining the mystery. Therefore, we shouldn't consider that there's something more mysterious about these mountains or more mysterious about these 7 kings. The readers were supposed to understand what was going on here based on this information. Therefore, it would seem that the beast upon which the woman rode is Rome. And we are told that the current emperor was the 6th, which would be Caesar. Now, verse 11 is extremely difficult to interpret, and so are verses, verse 8 is particularly difficult. Verse 8 says, "The beast which you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition." Now, that's a strange thing. It was and is not. It sounds as if the beast does not exist in John's day, and yet in verse 10 it says, 5 kings have fallen, but 1 now is, and these are the 7 heads on the beast. So we've got a bit of confusion here. It's kind of mixed up. One of the things that's mixed up is that the 7 heads have 2 identifications. 7 heads on one hand are seen as 7 mountains, and secondarily as 7 emperors, or 7 kings, which tells you right there that we're going to have some overlapping of thoughts. Now, why the beast is said to have been in the past and is not now, but will arise out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition, is not entirely clear. However, we did see in chapter 11, I pointed this out in our previous session, in chapter 11, In verse 7, it says, "The beast that ascends from the bottomless pit shall make war with them," that is the two witnesses. And when we talk about chapter 11, I suggested that the two witnesses, the career of the two witnesses represents the entire career of the church throughout the entire church age. It would appear at the very end of that period, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war with the church and seemingly overcome it. At the time we covered chapter 11, I also compared it with chapter 20, which, since we have not covered it yet, you may not know where I go with that, but in chapter 20, Satan is seen as bound in the abyss, in the bottomless pit, for 1,000 years, and then released for a little while at the end to deceive the nations, and they go out to come against the church, against the beloved city. Now, I said that chapter 20 and chapter 11 have this in common, that they both describe the church age, the majority of it, as a time where the church is bearing witness and ruling and is winning. But they also both speak of a time when someone comes out of the bottomless pit. In chapter 11, it's the beast. In chapter 20, it's the dragon. And then persecute and seemingly overcome the church for a little while. In Revelation 11, the time that the two witnesses are thought to be dead is 3.5 days, as opposed to the 3.5 years of their general testimony. In Revelation 20, the contrast is between 1,000 years and a little while. The little while is the time of Satan having ascendancy over the church, having power over the church. I suggested that time that I understand this to mean that at the end of the church age there will be a relatively short period of time during which Satan, through governmental powers, through state powers, will persecute the church, perhaps globally, and if so, drive the church essentially underground. Now, the church has been persecuted in localities all through church history, but never all over the entire world has there never been a Christian, a place where Christians could not testify and continue the testimony. And so that if this scenario is correct, then that little season or a little while at the end of Revelation 20 and the 3.5 days of Revelation 11, when the beast and the dragon ascend out of the bottomless pit, is the very end of the church age. Now, when it says in Revelation 17:8, the beast was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition, when it says will ascend out of the bottomless pit may refer to the end of the age, or the time that we read about at the end of the two witnesses' testimony and so forth. As far as the is not, why he says the beast is not now, I am not able to say. I really don't know. But some have felt, and I don't agree with them, that John is here reflecting the so-called Nero Redivivus myth, that the belief that Nero had died by the time this was written, but they were afraid he was going to come back. He's going to ascend out of the bottomless pit again, and there was a general feeling among the unsaved in Rome. The Roman citizenry thought that Nero was going to come back from the dead and wage war against the citizens of Rome. And that is testified to in many documents, the secular historical documents of the period of Tacitus and Suetonius and many others, record that there was this myth that Nero would come back. Some feel like John was deceived into buying into this myth and relates it in chapter 8, but I think that's silly. John was not deceived. He was writing visions that God showed him, so I don't understand how people can argue that way without taking away from the inspiration of the book. Excuse me. And so I have to say there's some things I still don't understand about this, but it seems that the reference to the beast that you saw was and is not is somewhat difficult to explain. Also, verse 11 is very difficult to explain. The beast that was and is not is himself the eighth. Now that's strange, because we've read of 7, of which the present ruler, in verse 10, is said to be the 6th, followed by a 7th, and then in verse 11 we hear of an 8th, an 8th who is one of the previous 7, but who is not now, and previously, will ascend out of the bottomless pit or whatever. This has led some to believe that, the Antichrist at the end of the world will be Nero come back or something like that. But that's, honestly, I don't know what verse 11 means. I'm just at a loss. As a teacher of the Bible, I have to teach through passages, many of which I have not yet figured out what they mean. So I have to leave that one unanswered. In general, though, it seems like the beast is the Roman Empire, particularly under Nero. And then the 10 horns, we talked about the 7 heads, they are the 7 hills and 7 kings. The 10 horns are mentioned in verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet. But they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the waters, well, let's stop there for a moment. These 10 kings who have not yet received power, but will reign with the beast for 1 hour, and will make war with the Lamb, these verses seem to me to be some verses that if other things were amenable, could make a strong case for the futurist view. Some kings that have not yet arisen in John's day. Well, if they hadn't arisen in John's day, then they could hardly be the kings that were associated with the fall of Jerusalem or even with the fall of Rome necessarily. Well, it could be the fall of Rome, I suppose, because that was some centuries off from John's time. Could conceivably be. But perhaps the futurists would seem to have the strongest explanation here of saying, well, this is some far-off future time, certain kingdoms, nations that didn't even exist in John's day will make war with the Lamb, and this war against the Lamb would be seen as at the second coming of Christ. Now, despite the fact that some of the features of this passage may sound like they'd support the futurist view, I would have a hard time with that particular interpretation here, because at the second coming of Jesus, I don't think anyone's going to be fighting against him. He's going to come in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that know not God and that obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. The heavens are going to be dissolved and the earth's going to burn up, and I don't really see how anyone can wage war against a supernatural invasion from heaven like that. They may, momentarily wish to, but in the twinkling of an eye, it'll all be over. And I don't really see how anyone can be said to wage war against Jesus at his second coming. Therefore, despite the temptation to make this war against the Lamb that, I think it is possible that we should see these 10 horns as the same 10 horns mentioned, surprise, in Daniel chapter 7. If you look at Daniel chapter 7, the fourth beast, which was Rome, had 10 horns, and we are given some information about them. In Daniel 7 and verse 24. Daniel 7:24 says, the 10 horns are 10 kings. Sounds like Revelation 17. Who shall arise from this kingdom, that is from the Roman Empire, the fourth beast, and shall rise after them, and he shall be different from the first ones. Now that one that arises after him is the little horn. Now when we talk about Daniel, I pointed out that while some people make this a futuristic reestablishment of the Roman Empire on 10 modern nations, and the little horn be a reference to last days Antichrist, the historic interpretation of this, as Christians have usually understood Daniel before dispensationalism came along, was that these 10 kings represent the 10 ethnic nations into which the Roman Empire broke up, that it divided into 10 ethnic nations. I mentioned them when we were in Daniel. I'll mention them quickly now. You probably have them in your notes of Daniel, so I won't take the time for you to write them down now. But number 1 would be the Huns in Hungary, 2, the Ostrogoths in Mysia, 3, the Visigoths in Pannonia, 4, the Sueves and the Alans in Spain, 5, the Vandals in Africa, 6, the Franks in France, 7, the Burgundians in Burgundy, 8, the Heruli and the Turingi in Italy, 9, the Saxons and Angles in Britain, and 10, the Lombards upon the Danube and later in Italy. Now, these 10 were listed, at least by some older commentators before dispensationalism came along, as the 10 horns, the 10 ethnic nations into which the Roman Empire divided. Now, in Daniel, it says that these will rise out of, or they grow on, they come from, the Roman Empire. The dispensational futurist view is essentially that there will be a revived Roman Empire in the last days. The reason for this, largely, is that in Daniel, there is the image that has the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay, which legs of iron are clearly the Roman Empire, the same as this fourth beast in Daniel 7 is. The legs resolve into feet and toes. And on a human image, the toes would be 10 in number. And in that image, a stone is seen to break it into pieces. And that stone is identified in Daniel 2:44 as the kingdom of God being established. Now, dispensationalism teaches that the kingdom of God will not be established until the second coming of Christ. This is a position I would disagree with them on, but that is their position. The kingdom of God will be established at the second coming of Christ. Therefore, since the stone smiting this image in the feet represents to them the second coming of Christ, then they would have to say these feet must represent some kingdom that exists at the end of the world when Jesus comes back. Since the feet have 10 toes, although Daniel doesn't say so, it is assumed, and since they have much of the elements of the Roman Empire in them because they're part of the legs of iron, which represents Rome, the dispensationalists believe there is a lengthy gap between the legs and the feet. That the legs do represent the historic Roman Empire, but the feet represent a revived Roman Empire in the last days consisting of 10 nations in confederacy. They then would take Daniel 7 to mean the same. The fourth beast, they would agree, is the Roman Empire. But the 10 horns they would believe to be the revived Roman Empire in the last days, made up of 10 nations. Now, Hal Lindsey and many others have believed and said in print that the modern European economic community, sometimes called the common market in Europe, is going to be, or is, the 10-nation confederacy that is to be recognized as the revival of the ancient Roman Empire. And they believe that the Antichrist will rise from this 10-nation confederacy and will rule the world. And then, of course, this is the 10 nations that will be stricken in the feet, or when Jesus comes. Now, as you know, my interpretation of Daniel does not insist on what seems to me a strange notion, that Jesus' kingdom will not be established until the second coming. Since the New Testament teaches that he established his kingdom at his first coming, I see the natural interpretation of Daniel to be that the feet of that image that were struck were the ancient Roman Empire. That the 10 horns that grew out of the beast also happen in attached to the historic Roman Empire, and I don't see any place in the Bible an insistence on a future revival of the Roman Empire. This idea of a revived Roman Empire is one of the fundamental teachings of dispensationalism, yet there's not a shred of biblical evidence that there must be a revived Roman Empire in the last days, unless we assume a huge gap between the ankles and the feet of the image, between the head of the fourth beast and its 10 horns, and unless we assume that the kingdom of God cannot be established until Jesus comes back. Now, if the historic church tradition of the 10 horns in Daniel is true, if this refers to the 10 nations into which the Roman Empire dissolved, then if we take that application to Revelation, then he'd be saying the same thing. Those nations had not yet really arisen as separate nations in John's time, but they did in the 5th and 6th centuries, and therefore that would be what's referred to here. They have no kingdom as yet, but they will receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast, and so forth. Now, it says, these will make war with the Lamb. This could be seen in a number of ways, but I think principally it is a spiritual warfare. The Lamb is represented by his followers on earth, the church. And the warfare is against them. And one reason I say so is because we saw that in chapter 11, where the two witnesses are at war. In chapter 11, verse 7, it said, now when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends from the bottomless pit will make war against them and overcome them. I said at the time we covered that chapter, I believe that's the church in spiritual warfare, or actually being under persecution. But there's a number of places where we will see the Lamb at war with the nations of the earth. And I believe we'll see it again at the end of chapter 19. And he is victorious over them. Here it is stated very briefly. He will overcome them, verse 17:14. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. So I believe that these 10 nations making war with the Lamb speaks of the continuing persecution of the church by the nations of the world and the spiritual warfare of the church and the ultimate victory of the church who are faithful unto death. There is a more expanded vision of that same battle in chapter 19, beginning of verse 11. We'll talk about that before we're done here today, I believe. Now, some of these things I simply can't clarify because I don't have as much clarity as I wish I did on these. I'm suggesting to you what I consider to be possibilities in many cases. Verse 15, Revelation 17:15. And he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, and make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are finished. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, here we have the clearest statement of who the woman is. She is that great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. Here is where we have to get serious about trying to decide who the city is. The two positions that strike me as the most viable, the most defensible, are A, that it's Rome, and B, that it's Jerusalem. On the surface, Rome seems to be the best answer. But looking a little more carefully, I personally believe Jerusalem will show to have more evidence in its favor. Though I'm only giving these as two theories, you have to weigh the evidence yourself. In favor of Rome, we could say that in verse 16, the 10 horns hate the harlot and destroy her. That does not seem to fit Jerusalem very well, since the 10 horns are kings who have not yet risen in John's day, and therefore would not be presumably participating in the destruction of Jerusalem. Furthermore, in verse 18, certainly Rome fits best a natural reading of that statement. The woman, who is called Babylon in the same chapter in verse 5, referred to as Mystery Babylon, the woman is said to be that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. In John's day, Rome was that great city that ruled over the empire, which took under its dominion all the kings of the earth. Now, those points particularly seem to support Rome. Furthermore, in verses 2 through 3, especially 3, he says, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast which was full of names and blasphemy. Now, the woman is that city. The beast could be thought to be the Roman Empire. Therefore, the woman, the harlot, is, by some people's interpretation, the city of Rome, which sits atop the Roman Empire. Okay, the Roman Empire was somewhat spread out, but the city of Rome was the central head of that, like the woman. And according to this view, it's talking about the fact that those countries that were vassals under Rome would someday hate Rome and burn Rome and destroy Rome. And that did happen. Rome didn't fall in a moment. It fell over a period of several decades by repeated waves of invasion by persons, who were hostile. Now, one of the problems is, well, I shouldn't say that. Some of the persons that were hostile were the Huns and people like that who could be identified as among the 10 horns. And so the theory that it's Rome seems to have a lot of weight. Furthermore, in chapter 18, also, it emphasizes a couple of times that the kings of the earth have, it says in verse 3 of chapter 18, the kings of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And again in chapter 18, verse 9, it says, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her. So that the kings of the earth seem to be somehow connected, enriching themselves, and being ruled over by this harlot, this Babylon. Now, because that sounds like it's more widespread than Jerusalem and Israel, and because it's hard to know how it could be said that Israel or Jerusalem was the city that ruled over the kings of the earth, many have felt Rome is the best identification. In fact, possibly most have. And it may be. In chapter 17, I must admit, the woman sounds an awful lot like Rome. However, there's a number of factors that incline toward the identification of the woman with Jerusalem. not the least of which is that we've encountered Babylon previously in chapter 14 and chapter 16. And in both of those contexts, there was, to my mind, strong evidence that we were looking at the time frame of the destruction of Jerusalem. And in the context of chapter 14, verse 8, where it says Babylon has fallen, and chapter 16, verse 19, where it said Babylon came into remembrance because of her fornication and so forth, the context seemingly would identify her as Jerusalem. Likewise, I pointed out earlier that the first city in Revelation to be called the Great City, which is repeatedly applied here to the harlot, in, for example, chapter 17, verse 18, and also chapter 18, verses 10 and 18, and others. There's repeatedly called the Great City or that Great City. The first city to be called the Great City in Revelation in chapter 11, verse 8 was Jerusalem. So those things may be taken into consideration. Then, in chapter 17, verse 16, the destruction of the woman, of the harlot, could be a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, although it's hard to know exactly how the 10 horns fit into that picture. The identification of the 10 horns is a bit of a problem anyway. But the point is that they seem to be instrumental in the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's, or I should say of the harlot. And the destruction of the harlot could be in view here, although those who hold that it's Rome could see that way, of course. There's a number of things in chapter 18, or a number of places where it speaks of a sudden collapse of the harlot. In chapter 18, verse 8, it says, "Therefore her plagues will come in one day." Chapter 18, verse 10 says at the end of it, "For in 1 hour your judgment has come." And in the same chapter, verse 19, at the end of that verse, it says, "For in 1 hour she is made desolate." Although neither Jerusalem nor Rome fell in 1 hour, literally, yet the suggestion is made that this is a rapid collapse. And Jerusalem fell somewhat rapidly, whereas Rome's fall was stretched out over quite a period of time, over a century. And so the suddenness of her fall might seem to point more in the direction of Jerusalem than Rome. But perhaps the most important information that would point in the direction of it being Jerusalem is the identification of the woman as a harlot. A harlot is one who commits adultery against her husband. And one thing that is said again and again from chapter 17 on is that this is a woman who is a harlot, in verse 1 of 17, a harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth commit fornication, and so forth. It's hard to know how Rome could be called a harlot, since she never was in covenant relationship with God, and therefore her idolatry was not really harlotry against her husband, as it would be in the case of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is referred to as a harlot repeatedly in the Old Testament, and since most of the imagery of Revelation is taken from the Old Testament, then it would seem suitable to look at the Old Testament use of the term to identify the harlot in this case. In Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 21, Isaiah 1:21, it says, "How has the faithful city become a harlot? It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers." It's speaking of Jerusalem. How has the faithful city, meaning Jerusalem, become a harlot, he says, in identifying Jerusalem as a harlot. In Ezekiel chapter 16, and these are just a few cases, there's actually a number of places where this comes out. Ezekiel 16, Ezekiel tells a parable about God, like a man, finding Israel like a little baby girl who's been abandoned at birth, left exposed to the elements, and how he fed her and protected her and clothed her, and then she grew up and she became his wife. And then she played the harlot. And, for example, it says in chapter 16 of Ezekiel, verse 15, "But you trusted in your own beauty and played the harlot because of your fame, and poured out your harlotry on everyone passing by who would have it." Now, by the way, he goes on to say that she played the harlot with the Philistines and with other nations, with Tyre and Babylon and so forth. Now, the harlot in Revelation 17, it says in verse 2, "with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication." It says in chapter 16 of Ezekiel that Jerusalem or Israel played the harlot with everyone around, with many Gentiles, and this has to do more with taking in the idols of the other nations, taking the husbands of other nations and worshiping them. That's the fornication that's referred to. So it seems like it's a clear identification with Jerusalem in the Old Testament whenever the term harlot is used. And Hosea is another place, obviously, where Hosea married a woman of harlotry, and she represented Jerusalem. Or actually, she represented Israel in general, the nation. And, for example, in Hosea chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "Bring charges against your mother. Bring charges, for she is not my wife, nor am I her husband. Let her put away her harlotries from her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and expose her as in the day that she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst." Now, he said that he was going to take the harlotress Jerusalem and make her like a wilderness. This woman is seen out in the wilderness here in the vision. And she is a harlot. And if we are to use the Old Testament language to help us identify the harlot in Revelation, as we use Old Testament language to identify most of the symbols in Revelation, then the harlot would most naturally be understood to be Jerusalem, the one or Israel, who is called a harlot in the Old Testament repeatedly. Now, furthermore, in chapter 18, where all these laments are made about the fall of Babylon, particularly a few verses sound like they could be a reference to Jerusalem. Some of them are a far cry, and some of them are fairly clear. For example, in verse 14 of chapter 18, it says, "The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all." Now, basically, this is saying the fruit that you've longed for, you'll never find anymore. In the Old Testament, God was continually looking for fruit from Israel. And when Jesus came to Jerusalem in the last week of his earthly ministry, he saw a fig tree, and he was looking for fruit on it. He found no fruit and said, "No one will ever eat fruit from you anymore, ever again, forever." In Matthew 21:19. And it sounds a little like this statement. It says, "The fruit is gone, and you shall find them no more at all." It sounds a little like Jesus' statement to the fig tree. But that's a little more obscure. We have something maybe a little more clear in verse 16 of chapter 18. And saying, "Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls." Now, the temple hangings were of purple and scarlet, and there was much gold and so forth. And it says there, she was adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. In Luke 21, before Jesus, just as the setting in which Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse, it says in Luke 21:5, "Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, As for these which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that is not thrown down." It says that they noticed that the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and donations. Here, the harlot is said to have been adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. All of these were found in the temple as ornaments of the temple, and it may be a reference here to that, although it also could refer to the fall of Tyre. In Ezekiel 28:13, it said that the king of Tyre had every precious stone for his covering. More indicative as you go along. As you go through chapter 18 of Revelation, there's more and more hints that would point toward Jerusalem. For example, in verse 20, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her." Now, Rome killed some of the apostles, we know, but so did Jerusalem. And the prophets, Jesus said, were all killed by Jerusalem. So when it says that the fall of this harlot is God's vengeance and God's vindication of the apostles and prophets, all the apostles were persecuted by Jerusalem, and James was put to death in Jerusalem. Peter was put in jail in Jerusalem. And later on, James, the brother of Jesus, he was killed by the Sanhedrin in 62 AD, according to Josephus. And therefore, several apostles were killed by the rulers in Jerusalem. And Jesus said all the prophets were. And so when it says her fall is God's vindication of the holy apostles and prophets, it seems Jerusalem fits better than Rome does in this particular designation. Then, in verse 22 and 23, it says, the sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore, and no craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore, and the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore, and the light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall not be heard in you anymore, for your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. Now, look at Jeremiah chapter 7, where we see where the echoes are from here in Revelation. In Jeremiah chapter 7, in verse 34, speaking to Jerusalem, God says, then I will cause to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land shall be desolate. Now look at Jeremiah 25:10. Jeremiah 25:10. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. And this whole land shall be a desolation and astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Let's talk about Jerusalem being destroyed. God's going to take away from Jerusalem all these things. The voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the voice of mirth and music and gladness, the sound of the millstone, the light of the lamp. All these things are listed in Revelation 18, 22, and 23 as being taken away. Now, of course, the same language could be used of God destroying any city. All those things would be taken away, no matter what city was in view. But the interesting thing is that the language of Revelation 18, 22, and 23 is definitely taken from these passages in Jeremiah, which were uttered about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And in verse 23, where it says at the end of it, for your merchants were the great men of the earth. Certainly that has been true of the Jews for a long time, and was true before the fall of Jerusalem as well. They have made their mark as merchants and have become great men of the earth. In fact, even in our own day, it still is the case. The media is largely owned and controlled by Jewish people. I mean, that's not a statement of question. The founders and owners and the boards of directors of the three major television networks were Jewish, for the most part. Is stacked overbalanced with Jews in them. And certainly many of the wealthiest people in the world are Jews. Now, that's not a statement against them. That's just a fact. And that their merchants were the great men of the earth certainly has proven to be the case, and was the case, no doubt, even in ancient times. That's possibly why the Gentiles hated them and probably were jealous of them. Also, verse 24, repeating what was in verse 19, or what was in verse 20, excuse me. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth, or in the land. Once again, this identification of the harlot who slew the prophets and the saints seems to point to Jerusalem. So here's some factors here. Now, let me say also that chapter 18, it's hard to know how much to identify as literal. The ships and so forth, and the people mourning at the city falling suddenly and so forth, could all be figurative, because all of those factors come from quotes from the Old Testament. And as I said, most of the quotes in chapters 17 and 18 of lament over Babylon are taken from the actual laments over the historic Babylon in Jeremiah, or sometimes in the Psalms, and sometimes of Isaiah. And a few of them, several, are taken from the lament against Tyre in Ezekiel. For instance, let me run down real quickly through some of the cross-references. They're not all in the margin of your Bible, probably. I've had to look these up one by one to find them. But where it says in verse 2, Babylon the Great has fallen, has become the habitation of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. This comes from Isaiah 13, verses 21 and 22, where it is uttered about historic Babylon. Verse 3, all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Comes from Jeremiah 51:7. Jeremiah 51:7, also spoken of Babylon. In verse 4, where it says, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive her plagues. If that is Jerusalem, that makes good sense, because God called the church of Jerusalem out before the city was destroyed. But the language, come out from among her, lest you receive of her plagues, comes from three passages. Isaiah 48:20, where it refers to God's people coming out of Babylon. That's Isaiah 48:20. And twice in Jeremiah, where it also refers to Babylon. Jeremiah 58, that is 50, verse 8, and Jeremiah 51, verse 6. Verse 5 says, for her sins have reached to heaven. That's a statement that God made about Sodom in Genesis 18:20. Genesis 18:20, Sodom's sins had reached up into heaven. And of course, Jerusalem earlier was spiritually called Sodom in this book. Render to her, verse 6, render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works, is a reworking of an imprecation against Babylon found in Psalm 137, verse 8. Psalm 137, verse 8 says, blessed is he who will do to you, O Babylon, what you did to us. And so it says here in verse 6, render to her just as she rendered to you. An echo of that imprecation in Psalm 137, verse 8, which was about Babylon. Down in verse 7, at the bottom of verse 7, it says, she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, I will not see sorrow. That is an echo of Isaiah 47, verses 7 and 8, which in the original passage applies to Babylon. Verse 8, at the end of that, says, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. Verse 8, the last line, for strong is the Lord God who judges her, is a quote from Jeremiah 50 and verse 34. Jeremiah 50:34, spoken of Babylon. Verse 9 says, and the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her. This comes from Ezekiel 27:35, where it is spoken of as the fall of Tyre. Tyre was a merchant city, and most of the language in this passage about the shipmasters and those who did trade by the sea come right out of Ezekiel, spoken about the fall of Tyre, because that was a shipping city. Of course, Babylon was not, neither was Jerusalem. But if Jerusalem is being compared with Tyre and Babylon and these other heathen cities, then it is possible that the language would not be pressed too literally, but would simply be to recall the laments against those cities and likening Jerusalem to those cities. It's also, verse 9 also echoes Jeremiah 50, verse 46, which speaks of Babylon. In this chapter, verses 11 through 13, where it talks about the merchants mourning because they can't buy the merchandise anymore, and listing all the things, all the merchandise they can't buy anymore, comes from Ezekiel 27, verses 12 through 34, where you have a much more lengthy list of merchandise that they will mourn that they can't trade in anymore. That's of Tyre, spoken of about Tyre in Ezekiel 27, 12 through 34. In verse 16, where it says, in verse 16, that was clothed in fine purple, scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, reminds me, at least, of Ezekiel 28:13. I mentioned earlier, spoken of the king of Tyre. Before his demise, before judgment came, he had every precious stone for his covering. Precious stones adorn this city. What was that? That was Ezekiel 28:13. Down in verse 21, when the mighty angel took a millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, thus with violence shall the city of Babylon be thrown down. That image of casting a millstone into the sea and saying Babylon should be thrown down like that is from Jeremiah 51, verses 63 and 64. Jeremiah 51, 63 and 64, I'll read it. It says, "Now it shall be when you have finished reading this book that you shall tie a stone to it and throw it out into the Euphrates. Then you shall say, thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her, and they will be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah." So throwing a stone onto this prophecy about Babylon and throwing it into the Euphrates so it would sink and say Babylon's going to sink like that is like this casting a stone into the sea and saying that's how Babylon's going to go down. A similar image. We already talked about verses 22 and 23 and how they echo Jeremiah 7:34 and Jeremiah 25:10. In those cases, those things are said about Jerusalem. The last sentence in verse 23, "For your merchants were the great men of the earth," is taken from Isaiah 23:8. Isaiah 23:8, where it refers to Tyre. Okay. And when it says at the end of verse 24, in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth. That expression, all who were slain on the earth, seemingly echoes Jeremiah again, chapter 51, where a lot of these come from. Jeremiah 51 and verse 49. "As Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall, so at Babylon shall the slain of all the earth fall." The slain of all the earth shall fall there, it says. It sounds like Revelation 18:24. "In her was found the blood of all who were slain on the earth." So, we've got really a couple of choices. Oh, I should make this comment. Some might say that the thing that makes it seem most like it can't be Jerusalem is that there's repeated references to the kings of the earth. For instance, in chapter 17, verse 2, it says, "With whom the kings of the earth committed fornication." Okay? And in chapter 17, verse 18, "The woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." Certainly Jerusalem did not reign over the kings of the earth. However, we should take into consideration the usage of that expression elsewhere. The same expression in the Greek, kings of the earth, is found in Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4 and verse 26, where Peter is quoting from Psalm 2. Or the disciples in praying are quoting from Psalm 2. And verse 26 of Acts 4 says, "The kings of the earth," the same expression found in Revelation repeatedly, "the kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ." Now, having quoted that, the apostles give their understanding of that verse, verse 27. "For truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together." Now, they are interpreting verse 26. The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord, against his Christ. The apostles understood that to be fulfilled in Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel. Now, the point is that those persons were all within Israel. Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel who put Jesus to death and who before whom he stood were all confined to one geographical place, Israel. And yet it says the kings of the earth took their stand, which means that in this context at least, the kings of the earth can refer to rulers of the land. Earth, of course, can be translated land. And kings, Pilate wasn't a king. The Sanhedrin weren't kings. Herod really wasn't a king either. He was a tetrarch. So, really the word kings would have to be understood in this case just meaning rulers, general rulers. And since Israel is the location where these rulers were who crucified Christ, then land must be a better interpretation, in at least that case. Now, I don't say that it always should be understood that way, But at least in some cases, it may be necessary to recognize kings of the earth as better understood as rulers of the land. Now look back at Revelation 1:5. Revelation 1:5. Of course, this too is a disputed portion as to its meaning, but Jesus is described as the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler over the kings of the earth. Which could mean the literal kings of the whole planet Earth, and it would be true, he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but it could mean the rulers of the land, who were going to be mourning, according to verse 7, because of his coming in 70 AD, as I understand it. That's not too clear what is meant there, but in chapter 6 of Revelation, and verse 14, no, not 14, 15. It says, and the kings of the earth, the same expression, or rulers of the land, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who is able to stand? Now, there were many indicators in that chapter, chapter 6, that this was talking about the fall of Jerusalem. Therefore, the kings of the earth must be the rulers of the land, who weep and who fear and who hide in caves and dens of the earth. Josephus tells us that the inhabitants of Jerusalem did hide in caves and caverns from the Romans coming in, which was seen as the wrath of the Lamb coming against them. Furthermore, Jesus said to the Sanhedrin, who condemned him, you will see the Son of Man coming with clouds and great glory, and it could be a reference to the fulfillment of that. The important thing, though, is that there's much in the passage that would identify this as a local catastrophe if we compare Scripture to Scripture. After all, even the statement saying to the mountains and hills, fall on us and hide us, Jesus said to the woman of Jerusalem, weep for yourselves and your children, because the hour is coming when they will say to the mountains, hide on us and fall on us and hide us. Which means he was talking about the inhabitants of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and this is the language of that. So there's some reason to believe that in Revelation 6:15, the kings of the earth should be interpreted rulers of the land. Not in every case, possibly, but in some cases, that would be the designation for rulers of the land rather than kings of the earth. Now, in Revelation 17:2, where it says the kings of the earth or the rulers of the land have committed fornication with this woman, with Jerusalem, that would make sense. They've enriched themselves from her, according to chapter 18. Chapter 18, verse 3 says, all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath, and the kings of the earth, could be kings of the earth or it could be rulers of the land, have committed fornication with her. Likewise in chapter 18, verse 9, all the kings of the earth, or it could be rulers of the land, who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her, will weep and lament for her. Now, the main verse of importance is chapter 17, verse 18. 17:18, where it says, the woman whom you saw is that great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth, or the rulers of the land. We don't have any exact language parallels elsewhere to prove that this is Jerusalem, but let me just show you a few passages that may be of interest in this connection. In Lamentations 1:1, in Lamentations 1:1, says, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who was great among the nations. The princes among the provinces, the princess among the provinces has become a slave. This is referring to the city of Jerusalem. It is saying that that city was great among the nations, and she was a princess among the provinces. Let me read something else in the New Testament from Matthew chapter 2, where Matthew is quoting Micah about Bethlehem being the place of the Messiah's birth. Interestingly, Matthew chapter 2 and verse 6, notice how he quotes it. Matthew 2:6. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Bethlehem was a little village 6 miles south of Jerusalem, and it is said to be not the least of the rulers of Judah. The provinces, Jerusalem was the princess or the ruler of the provinces, and the provinces had their own rulers too. The kings or the rulers of the land looked to Jerusalem as the ruling city over them. I have a quote from Josephus here on this also. This is from his book, The Wars of the Jews, book 3, chapter 3, and paragraph 5. It begins at the bottom of page 641 in this edition, and it spills over just a little bit over into 642. This is book 3, chapter 3, paragraph 5 of the War of the Jews, or the Jewish Wars. It says, "The southern parts of Judea, if they be measured lengthwise, are bounded by a village adjoining to the confines of Arabia. The Jews that dwell there call it Jordan. However, its breadth is extended from the river Jordan to Joppa. The city Jerusalem is situated in the very middle, on which account some have, with sagacity enough, called that city the navel of the country. Nor indeed is Judea destitute of such delights as come from the sea, since its maritime places extend as far as Ptolemais. It was parted into 11 portions, of which the royal city Jerusalem was supreme, and presided over all the neighboring country as the head does over the body. And to the other cities that were inferior to it, they presided over their several toparchies." Now, it talks about cities that were inferior to Jerusalem presiding over their areas. In other words, they had their rulers. But Jerusalem, as a head over a body, presided over the other provinces. And it's interesting that it says that they had no shortage of things that could be bought at sea. It says, "Nor indeed was Judah destitute of such delights as come from the sea, since its maritime places, or its seaboard places, extend as far as Ptolemais." So even the references to those who trade at sea will no longer be able to trade with you could apply to Jerusalem if we extend it as the ruler over the whole area of Judea, where there were some seaports and so forth. Anyway, this is not perhaps conclusive that Babylon refers to Jerusalem. As I've tried to point out, there's some pretty strong arguments in favor of Rome being mentioned here. But it seems to me also that there's some strong arguments for it being Jerusalem. I am in the process of learning what Revelation means still. And by this time next year I might have made, a more solid decision. But I believe that the evidence is strongest in favor of it being Jerusalem. And that would agree with the previous two references to Babylon in chapter 14 and chapter 16, which apparently referred to Jerusalem there also. And therefore, it is the city, the great city, which reigns over the rulers of the land, as we should understand it. Now that interpretation is not devoid of difficulties. There are difficulties still, not the least of which has to do with who the 10 horns are that destroy this harlot. I'm not sure what to say. Obviously, when the Romans came, they came with a multinational force, because it was taken from all the Roman Empire. The army was drafted from the entire empire. And therefore, there were probably at least 10 nations that were involved in besieging Jerusalem. And yet, the problem with that is that those 10 horns are said to be kings that have not yet received any dominion. Maybe, however, it means those that have not yet received dominion apart from the Roman Empire itself, that they will have their own private dominion later on when Rome falls. It's really hard to know. But those are the issues. There are other considerations that you may find on your own that will incline you one way or another, but it seems to me that all things taken together, the evidence is more favorable toward Babylon being Jerusalem than Rome. And that it must be either Jerusalem or Rome seems clear by the fact that John says that the city, or the angel tells John, the city was a city currently reigning over either the kings of the earth or the rulers of the land in chapter 17, verse 18. He doesn't say will rule, says does rule. Therefore, it was a city current in John's time. And the only two cities that could possibly be designated that way would have to be Jerusalem and Rome. Those are the only two serious options. And there are good arguments for both suggestions. If it is Rome, then we have in this portion of Revelation the prophecy extending, of course, beyond the fall of Jerusalem to the ultimate fall of Rome. That is how J. Adams and some other interpreters have understood it. You can see that there's some good reasons they could, but it's not necessarily the only preterist approach. Chapter 19, then, we'll finish out this segment. After these things I heard a loud voice of a great multitude in heaven saying, Alleluia, salvation and glory and honor and power to the Lord God. For true and righteous are his judgments, that is, in destroying Jerusalem or Rome, one or the other. Let's just say Babylon. He has shown his righteousness. He's had good cause to do it. He has not done an unrighteous thing in destroying them. Because he has judged the great harlot who corrupted the earth with her fornication. And by the way, the Jews who saw Jerusalem as their capital and who made regular pilgrimages back to Jerusalem were dispersed throughout the whole earth. And it could be said that the corrupt Judaism that was centered at Jerusalem did corrupt the entire earth, as it were. They were scattered abroad. As we know, most of the Jews did not live in Judea, but over 2/3 of the population, the world's population of Jews lived outside Jerusalem in other countries, in the diaspora.
Could it be land?
Could be land, could be earth, whatever, yeah. Okay. Who corrupted the earth or the land, right, with her fornication, and he has avenged on her the blood of his servants by her. Again they said, Alleluia, and her smoke rises up forever and ever. That expression was found back in chapter 14 and verse 11. The smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. As I pointed out at that time, that statement itself is an echo from Isaiah 34, 8 through 10. Isaiah 34, 8 through 10. And in the context of chapter 14, that appeared to be a statement about Jerusalem. Although in the context, all that is really said clearly about it is that it's a judgment that comes upon those who worship the beast. Now, then a voice, verse 5, 19:5, then a voice came from the throne saying, Praise our God, all you his servants and those who fear him, both small and great. And I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, as the sound of many waters, and as the sound of mighty thundering, saying, Alleluia, for the Lord God omnipotent reigns. His reign, the Lord God, Jesus Christ, is demonstrated by the fact that he's vindicated himself over those who opposed his kingdom. The Lamb has overcome them because he's King of kings and Lord of lords. Now, that could be seen in the fall of Rome or the fall of Jerusalem. This great multitude, as the sound of many waters, saying this may be a reference to the church. It may be the same great multitude found in chapter 7, where it talked about a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, kindred, people, and tongue, who were singing praises to the Lord. It may be the same group here. The church, the many Gentile converts that arise as on the tail of the destruction of Jerusalem. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. And he said to me, Right, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true sayings of God. And I fell at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, Don't do that. I am your fellow servant and of your brethren who have the testimony of Jesus. Again, a servant of God and a servant of the brethren. The angels are ministering spirits sent forth to minister to those who are heirs of salvation, who have the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Now, the statement about the marriage of the Lamb obviously needs some comments. There is, the dispensational view teaches that sometime, probably soon, the church is going to be raptured into the clouds, where the church will remain for 7 years with Christ until he comes back to earth and judges the world and sets up the millennial kingdom. That same 7 years that the church is gone with Christ is called the tribulation period, and horrible things are happening to the people who are left on earth during that time. It is generally said that that meeting in the clouds is the marriage supper of the Lamb. In fact, I don't know of any dispensational writer who does not say that. I see it again and again and again, and hear it again and again and again in the sayings and teachings and the books of dispensationalists. The marriage supper of the Lamb is 7 years long. During the time when the tribulation is taking place on earth, the church is with Christ in the clouds having the marriage supper of the Lamb. Well, okay, obviously that assumes a futurist view of this particular passage. And And, all things considered, we can't rule out that there may be a reference here to the second coming of Christ, but I think not. This is the only place in the Bible where the expression marriage supper of the Lamb is used. But it's not the only place in the Bible that speaks of a marriage. Back in Matthew chapter 22, we have a parable from Jesus about this marriage. Matthew 22 and verse 2 says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. The king is God, his son is Jesus, and the marriage is the marriage of Jesus, the marriage of the Lamb." Okay? "And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, but they were not willing to come. Again, he sent out his other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the wedding.' But they made light of it and went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants and treated them spitefully and killed them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious, and he sent out his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding.' So those servants went out to the highways and gathered together all those whom they found, both bad and good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who did not have on a wedding garment. So he said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Now, this is a lengthy parable, and having the time to talk about every verse, I think the best interpretation of this is as follows. Jesus is describing his own ministry at the time as being the invitation to the wedding. Those who were first invited were the Jews. The message was to the Jew first, and also to the Greeks. The Jews first received their invitation, but showed little interest in coming to the wedding. Therefore, it says the king sent out his armies and burned down their city, which he did in 70 AD. Then the message was concentrated on those on the outskirts, the Gentiles, and the highways and the byways. And they were to be invited in. And actually, good and bad responded to the invitation and came in. Now, this can't be after the second coming of Christ, this wedding, because there's not going to be any bad people sneaking in into heaven. The rapture is not going to accidentally pull up a few who are not deserving. At the rapture, God's going to call his own, and none others, up. So, we have here a feast which the Jews are first invited to, and then it's mainly populated by persons who are said to be called after the city was burned up, after Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, from the highways, from the outskirts, from far away, Gentiles called in. But this wedding feast has some bad people there who later have to be excluded because they don't have a wedding garment. In Revelation, the wedding garment is the righteous deeds of the saints. Here we have some people who've responded to the invitation, but they are not living righteous lives, and therefore they are kicked out. This wedding cannot be an eschatological thing happening at the end of the age, to my mind, since the Jews were invited before 70 AD, and their city was burned up because they refused to come. And yet, when he burned up the city, he said, "The wedding is ready. The feast is ready. Bring them in." So the idea is that the wedding feast is the church. The wedding party are the church people. In Matthew chapter 9, Matthew chapter 9, verse 14 says, "Then the disciples of John came to Jesus saying, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?' And Jesus said to them, 'Can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast.'" Now what he's saying is, these people are at a wedding feast. People don't mourn when they're celebrating a wedding. He indicated that he and his disciples were already at the wedding feast, and therefore it was inappropriate to mourn. Over in John chapter 3, John the Baptist's disciples come and complain to him that he's losing popularity and Jesus is gaining in popularity. And John the Baptist responds commendably. In John 3 and verse 29, John the Baptist says to his disciples, "He who has the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is fulfilled." He calls Jesus the bridegroom. He calls the people who are going to Jesus the bride. And John sees himself as the friend of the bridegroom. That is the matchmaker, the one who brought the bride to the bridegroom. That was John's ministry. Now the point is that all of these references to Jesus as a bridegroom, or to the wedding of Jesus, are fulfilled or have their context as the church age. Therefore, when it says in Revelation 19, the wedding of the Lamb has come, and the bride has made herself ready, and she was granted clean linen to wear and so forth, it would appear that this is just talking about the church age as a whole, is the wedding feast. Yes, John?
What about this? I know this is a parable, so, but when it talks about, bind them in and put and take and all that stuff, I think this is just a reference to the church age.
Well, I think that's the judgment of the last day.
Well, that is.
Yeah, I think the feast is populated with guests, good and bad, and he tolerates them, like the good fish and the bad fish brought in the net in the parable, or like the wheat and the tares growing together in the world in the parable. Both of those parables found in Matthew 13. He tolerates them until the end of the world, and then he sorts them out. And so I think when he talks about kicking out the guy who didn't belong there because he didn't have the right kind of clothing on, that refers to the ultimate weeding out of those that don't belong in the church at the judgment at the end, comparable to the sheep and the goats parable, or the wheat and the tares parable, or the dragnet parable, where there's fish of both kinds gathered in, but in the end of the age, the angels sort them out. So that's how I understand that. So the feast is populated with people before the judgment, before the end of the world. And it begins before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD in that parable. Yes? Oh, was your hand up again? Okay. All right then. So the wedding supper of the Lamb is associated with the church age. At the end of verse 10, there's this cryptic statement: the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. That has been understood a variety of ways, but since the expression the testimony of Jesus is frequent in the book of Revelation, I mean, it's one of the refrains, the testimony of Jesus, it seems to mean the testimony about Jesus, entrusted to the church. The church testifies about Jesus. The spirit of prophecy could be understood to mean the nature of prophecy, or the character of prophecy. Sometimes the word spirit is used that way in the Bible. And it could be meaning these prophecies are not so that you'll honor the angel. See, John had fallen down to worship the angel. The angel says, don't do that. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, meaning the purpose of these revelations is not for you to admire me, the angel who's given you the information. The purpose of these prophecies, the character of prophecy, is to exalt Jesus, to testify about Jesus. Therefore, worship Him. Worship God. Don't worship me. Now, the last verses we've got to take very quickly here. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. He was clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. And out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations. And he himself will rule them with a rod of iron, an image taken from Psalm 2, verse 9. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God. And he has on his robe and on his thigh the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay. What is this? Well, generally thought, especially by futurists, to be the second coming of Christ. When we read of the 1,000 years in chapter 20, it is assumed that that is 1,000 years that takes place after the coming of Christ, because it is assumed that this passage in 19 is about the coming of Christ. Now, even if that is so, it doesn't follow that the events of chapter 20 must follow the events of this, because this is the end of one segment. Chapter 20 begins another segment, just as we saw the end of the world and the second coming of Christ in chapter 11 at the end of there, and yet the birth of Jesus in the next chapter, 12. So also, many times, a segment will bring us to the end, and then the next segment will start over again. I think that happens anyway in chapter 20, that it starts early on again. But I'm not sure that this is the second coming of Christ. It could be. It could be. It's not associated with any distinct time period. Perhaps the end of the wedding feast is in view, in which case we would have the second coming of Christ. And then there's a judgment in verses 17 through 21 upon the wicked. Now, another way of seeing this, and has been understood by some, especially postmillennialists, is that verses 11 through 15 are talking not about the second coming of Christ, but the conquest of the earth by the gospel, by the sword that proceeds out of his mouth. The sword is the word of God. And the conquest is not done with things that really kill people, but with his words. Now, to my mind, there's more than one way to see this. The white horse that Jesus rides on, and those who follow him in the armies of heaven could be angels or could be simply the church, but not necessarily the church that's been raptured, perhaps the church that is, as it were, still on earth. We still have our citizenship in heaven. We are the armies of heaven. Even here on earth, our citizenship is in heaven, and we're seated in Christ in heavenly places. But whether this is the earthly warfare of Christ and his church coming against the nations with the gospel, with the sword that proceeds out of his mouth, conquering the nations in the way that the church has been doing for the past 2,000 years through the missionary efforts, especially the last 400, or 300 or 400 years, or whether it's the second coming of Christ, is fairly a toss-up in my mind. Maybe you don't think it should be a toss-up, but it is. I think it is. In Zechariah chapter 10, there's an interesting statement. Zechariah 10:3, God says, "My anger is kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the goat herds, for the Lord of hosts will visit his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them as his royal horse in battle." Now the people of God, in that case the people of Judah, are compared with God's horse, his horse in battle. Today the vehicle of Christ in the earth is the church. The white horse could be, Jesus riding on the white horse could be his, on the feet of the church, going to all nations, carrying his sword. The sword that proceeds out of his mouth could be the evangelistic efforts of the church. Could also be the second coming of Christ. It's not entirely clear to me. There are those who have interpreted both ways. Verse 17, "Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the heavens, in the midst of heaven, come and gather together to the supper of the great God." Now there's two feasts. There's the wedding supper of the Lamb, and there's this supper, the supper of the vultures. "That you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and those that sit on them, the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire burning with brimstone, and the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse. And all the birds were filled with their flesh." Now this picture of judgment seems most likely to my mind to refer to the second coming of Christ because of the beast and the false prophet reaching the end of their career. They're captured and thrown into the lake of fire. We saw in chapter 13 that the career of the beast is 3.5 years, which, compared to other places that speak of 3.5 years, may, with some credibility, be identified with the church age, figuratively speaking. In which case, this is the end of that period, and therefore the end of the church age, and therefore the second coming of Christ. This judgment, therefore, is reminiscent of Jesus' statement where the carcasses, the eagles, will be gathered. He made that statement once in connection to Jerusalem in Matthew 24, and he made it in connection with the end of the world in Luke chapter 17 and the second coming of Christ. When he said, "One will be taken and the other left, one will be taken and the other left." And they said, "Where, Lord?" And he said, "Where the carcasses are, where the body is, the eagles will be gathered." And that is talking, I believe, about his second coming. And here, I believe we have probably a description of his second coming. It seems to be the case since this is the end of the false prophet and the beast, whose careers, I believe, extend for the whole length of the church age. Now, when it says the rest were killed with the sword of him that sat on the horse, that may indicate that the horse vision of verses 11 and following were also about the second coming of Christ, since this latter part is. But that's not certain, to my mind, because from the fall of Jerusalem until the second coming of Christ, the horse, in a sense, is going out and smiting the nations. The picture of Christ on horseback in verses 11 through 16 can be a description of the mission of the church through the church age, and then the end of it is seen in verse 17 and to the end. It's, as I said, the verses 11 through 16, I am undecided about what that refers to, whether it's the mission of the church or Christ in the church, or whether it's the second coming of Christ, but I'm fairly convinced that verses 17 through 21 are about the second coming of Christ. Notice that everyone dies. In verse 21, the rest were killed with the sword. It raises the question, who then goes into the future millennium? Well, frankly, it raises the question of whether there is a future millennium. We encounter the concept of the millennium in chapter 20. And by the way, only in chapter 20. There's no place in the entire Bible other than Revelation 20 that speaks of the 1,000-year reign. Although some talk about it as if it's one of the most common notions in the Bible, it's found nowhere in the entire Bible except Revelation 20. And tomorrow, when we take that, we will discuss the various theories on that chapter. Heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. And the beast that was, and is not, is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Yeah. And he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw in the beast, these will hate the harlot, and make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become a habitation of demons, a prison of every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double, according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed, mix it for her double. In the measure that she has gloried herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. And the kings of the earth, who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her, will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys her merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. Verse 9 it says, Here is the mind that has wisdom. 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Rome was proverbially called the city of the 7 hills, and therefore any ancient reader would be inclined to see this as a reference to Rome because of the famous 7 mountains there. And so, by the way, the angel is saying that he's explaining the mystery. Therefore, we shouldn't consider that there's something more mysterious about these mountains or more mysterious about these 7 kings. The readers were supposed to understand what was going on here based on this information. Therefore, it would seem that the beast upon which the woman rode is Rome. And we are told that the current emperor was the 6th, which would be Caesar. Now, verse 11 is extremely difficult to interpret, and so are verses, verse 8 is particularly difficult. Verse 8 says, the beast which you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. Now, that's a strange thing. It was and is not. It sounds as if the beast does not exist in John's day, and yet in verse 10 it says, 5 kings have fallen, but one now is, and these are the 7 heads on the beast. So we've got a bit of confusion here. It's kind of mixed up. One of the things that's mixed up is that the 7 heads have 2 identifications. 7 heads on one hand are seen as 7 mountains, and secondarily as 7 emperors, or 7 kings, which tells you right there that we're going to have some overlapping of thoughts. Now, why the beast is said to have been in the past and is not now, but will arise out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition, is not entirely clear. However, we did see in chapter 11, I pointed this out in our previous session, in chapter 11, in verse 7, it says, the beast that ascends from the bottomless pit shall make war with them, that is the 2 witnesses. And when we talked about chapter 11, I suggested that the 2 witnesses, the career of the 2 witnesses represents the entire career of the church throughout the entire church age. It would appear at the very end of that period, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war with the church and seemingly overcome it. At the time we covered chapter 11, I also compared it with chapter 20, which, since we have not covered it yet, you may not know where I go with that, but in chapter 20, Satan is seen as bound in the abyss, in the bottomless pit, for 1,000 years, and then released for a little while at the end to deceive the nations, and they go out to come against the church, against the beloved city. Now, I said that chapter 20 and chapter 11 have this in common, that they both describe the church age, the majority of it, as a time where the church is bearing witness and ruling and is winning. But they also both speak of a time when someone comes out of the bottomless pit. In chapter 11, it's the beast. In chapter 20, it's the dragon. And then persecute and seemingly overcome the church for a little while. In Revelation 11, the time that the 2 witnesses are thought to be dead is 3.5 days, as opposed to the 3.5 years of their general testimony. In Revelation 20, the contrast is between 1,000 years and a little while. In Revelation chapter 17, this begins the 6th segment of the book. In our previous session, we took the 5th segment, which was a very short one. In fact, we took more than that. We took chapters 15 and 16, which I take to be the 5th segment. We also took chapter 14. The 6th segment is chapters 17, 18, and 19. And I hope that we can take the entire segment. It seems possible. Now, chapter 17 contains what probably should be identified as the opening vision of that segment. John is carried away into the wilderness where he sees another vision and is given an explanation of the vision. And then we have what in the notes that I gave you in the outline we could call 7 declarations of victory over Babylon, God's victory over Babylon. Now, it's in this section more than any other that we not only need to, but have opportunity to understand who Babylon is. We've encountered Babylon in chapter 14, verse 8, for the first time, and we've encountered Babylon in chapter 16, verse 19, but in those places I've been able to tell you what I think Babylon refers to, and mention there are some other opinions. It'll be in chapters 17 and 18 where we get the most information on this. In fact, I would like to read chapters 17 and 18, without comment first, so that afterwards I may draw from it the various data. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not, and yet is. In some manuscripts, that last yet is actually shall be present. So it would be the beast that was and is not and shall be present. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads, probably referring to slaves. And the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things, who became rich by her, will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches come to nothing. And every shipmaster, all who traveled by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What is like this great city? And they threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you, holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon will be thrown down, and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you any more. And no craftsman of any craft shall be found in you any more. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you any more. And the light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more. And the voice of a bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all that were slain on the earth, or possibly in the land. Now, this is not the end of the segment, because chapter 19 goes on, but in chapter 19 we don't have any further information that would help us to identify the harlot, and that's who we need to identify right off. Now, chapter 17, he sees the vision. In chapter 18, he simply hears announcements made by various angels. These announcements have to do with the fall of Babylon, and the language of them is sort of like the funeral dirges uttered against Babylon in Jeremiah 50 and 51, and also taken from some other dirges. There's some language here taken from Ezekiel of the fall of Tyre and Sidon, especially Tyre. And in one case, in verse 5 of chapter 18, there seems to be an echo of the fall of Sodom, or the sin of Sodom. So, what we have in chapter 18 is a mosaic of phrases from funeral dirges or laments that were uttered over cities in the Old Testament that fell. Most of the material comes from Jeremiah 51 and Ezekiel 28, which are dirges against Babylon and Tyre. Now, to identify this city, we go to chapter 17, because there we are told that we're getting an explanation. In verse 7, the angel said to me, Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her. So you expect to get some insight. However, as usual, the explanation is in some respects as hard to understand as the mystery itself. And the explanation doesn't necessarily clarify things as much as we would like. We should point out that, first of all, John saw in the wilderness. He was carried in the Spirit to the wilderness. The last time we saw the wilderness in Revelation was in chapter 12, where the woman who fled from the dragon was nurtured by God for 3.5 years into the wilderness. Here we see another woman in the wilderness. Not the woman of chapter 12 who fled for safety to the wilderness, but we see this woman now in the wilderness, and she is a harlot, whereas it could be argued that the woman who fled to the wilderness in chapter 12 was the bride. And we have a contrast between the bride and the harlot in the book of Revelation, just as we have a contrast between Babylon and the New Jerusalem. The two entities that are contrasted in Revelation are variously compared with cities or women. And it is clear that the harlot is Babylon, and that the bride is New Jerusalem. Now here, he sees the woman, but she is riding upon a beast. The beast is somewhat familiar to us. The beast is said to have 7 heads and 10 horns in verse 3, and that is the description that we saw of the first beast that came out of the sea in chapter 13, and therefore is almost certainly the same beast. Here we're told in verse 3 that it was scarlet in color, red. We were not told that about the beast in chapter 13, but in chapter 12 we saw that the dragon was red in color, and he also had 7 heads and 10 horns. So it would seem like the beast we are now told was red, had 7 heads and 10 horns, and all those characteristics it shared with the dragon. The dragon was Satan, and therefore the beast seems to be Satan in disguise. Satan with a thin skin or veneer stretched over him, acting through some kind of entity which could, as I said earlier, represent the state systems that Satan inspires against Christianity to persecute the saints. That's what I suggested in chapter 13. Now, at the time in which John wrote this, the particular state system that was doing this was the Roman Empire under Nero. And for the sake of his own readers in the first century, he tends to identify the beast for them, I think, as Rome, as Nero and Rome. And he does that when we get to chapter 17, verse 10. We saw this previously, where he talks about there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, that is the 6th, and 1 is not yet come, and when he comes he must continue a short time. If the 7 kings refers to 7 emperors, the first being Julius Caesar, the 6th, the one that he says now is, would have to be Nero. And therefore he identifies as what was at that time the current manifestation of the beast's activities was centered in Nero and the Roman Empire. And the beast has all the marks of Rome. The 7 heads not only represent 7 kings, but we're told they represent 7 hills, 7 mountains.